Hi, and welcome to episode 16 of our daily webinar series brought to you during the lockdown. Today, this episode was going to be the final episode in our series. This would have marked the end of the initial lockdown, but the lockdown is continuing, and don't worry, we are going to be with you as well. My name is Theron Nightenfit.
Yes.
I've got Mark Baker here. Say hi. You always just say, how's it? Say something else.
What must I say? Hi everyone. Look at my lockdown beard happening here. It's very exciting.
This is fairly consistent, this beard of mine. Anyway, we are jumping into something. I know I feel like I say this every day. I feel like I say that what we're going to be talking about is really exciting. For me, this is right up my alley. In fact, some of the stuff we're going to be speaking about today is what I did my master's dissertation on. So this really is something that I'm very passionate about. We are speaking about how to reimagine your world, and we're gonna try to get through this because both Mark and I have too much that we would like to say in this 1.5-hour episode. Let's do a quick recap. In the previous episode, the key concepts we looked at are how social media really can detract from our lives depending on how we consume it and what our habits are. One of the ways that happens, we looked at some different studies, and one of the ways that happens is through this idea of rumination and upward social comparisons. The key question we asked you in that webinar was, what can you add into your life to help bring balance and to make it more awesome? And we had some suggestions, and I think we'll go through those again later in the episode. Today, we are talking about how to reimagine your world. The themes we're going to be speaking about are the imagination, which I'm calling the engine of human accomplishment. And I'll spend a bit of time unpacking that for you guys just now. And then a call for embracing the potential that comes from that, from this very specifically human ability that we have to imagine. And then we're going to dive into and spend probably the bulk of this webinar on the power of emotional intelligence, or EQ. Many of you will be aware of emotional intelligence, and we haven't spent too long explaining about that over the webinars, but that's essentially what we do at Mygrow. We develop EQ, and Mark's going to walk you through why it is so powerful, especially in this question of how do we reimagine the world. Okay, the imagination. This is what I was sharing I'm super passionate about. For the last 10 years or so, the imagination has been something that for me has been a very interesting concept, human faculty, and something that I've invested a lot of time and effort and research into trying to understand. And I think for many of us, there is a misunderstanding around what the imagination is. And because of this misunderstanding, it leads to a false dichotomy about its own importance. And you can see in this picture, we've got a little artist with his little art thing, and we've got science on the other side. And often we have been led to believe that the imagination only lives in one side. It is not to be taken seriously. We're in the age of science and reason. That's what we take seriously. That's how we know things. Don't talk to me about the imagination. But actually, there's a false dichotomy there. Big words, but what it means is that thinking about the imagination as only being in one side and having a this versus this isn't actually true. The imagination is involved everywhere. Our perspective may have been that the arena of the imagination is for children. You can see that little kid on his trike there. Or the untrue or the fantastical, like this fisherman who's obviously imagining something very untrue about his ability to fish. Or, of course, as I mentioned, the artist. We have had a default view as a result of the Enlightenment and the age of reason and the age of science, the rise of science in the last few hundred years. We've had this understanding that the imagination is for the immature, it is false, or for the fantastical or the illusionary, and ultimately perhaps irrelevant, or at best indulgent, if you take the arts. Not really important, essentially, maybe a way of saying that. But actually, the imagination is the engine of human accomplishment. If you look at this slide, you can see we've got some guy with his drone, we've got a cement truck, we've got a detective, we've got an artist, and we've got those guys making fire at the beginning. The argument I have become convinced by, or I have been convinced by, is that the imagination really is the thing that sets the human creature apart from the rest of the natural order. Let's start there in the middle with those guys with the fire. I won't go into too much detail about how the imagination works. I think we're going to deal with that in future webinar episodes in the coming weeks. I think I'll spend a bit of time talking about that and the relevance of that for our time. But the fact that one little guy with his stick can do an experiment by rubbing it really hard, like, back and forth on another piece of wood there, because he knows that if you do this with your hands, they warm up. He's experienced that. And the power of the imagination is to be able to head off into the future and extrapolate out that idea and say, I wonder if I do it long enough and hard enough if my hands will catch fire. Fire, that great thing we've We discovered when the lightning came, I want that. That was hot. This is warm. Let's make this hot. You know what? That's a bit dangerous. Let's rather use two sticks. The imagination is what enables the human creature to go there. And this is why it's so important for science. But before we get there, let's jump into this comment here from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 18th century poet and philosopher. If you do any study on the imagination, this guy's name is going to come up. Very, very important thinker around what the imagination is. And here's one of his quotes. He says, "Things are only brought into being when they are perceived with the imagination." And what's perhaps missing there is the word first. When they are first perceived with the imagination. Imagine those guys rubbing those sticks together. They weren't just, you don't mindlessly do that to see what'll happen. You don't invest 40 minutes of your day rubbing sticks together unless you have imagined what's going to come from that. So the imagination goes forward and says, this might be the reality. Let's try and get there. In science, Albert Einstein, one of the biggest names, we of course all know Albert Einstein, needs no introduction. He says, imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress and giving birth to evolution. Another really important quote from one of the authors I really enjoy: every experiment, speaking about science, has its origin in hypothesis. And without the scaffolding of hypothesis, the house of science could never arise. So you can see there's this false dichotomy. And the construction of any hypothesis, whatever, is the work of the imagination. The imagination is not just for painters and kids and, crowd fishermen.
Sure.
The imagination is present in every single aspect of what it is we do as human beings.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, I'm going to dive a little bit more into this in coming episodes to just unpack a little bit more about how it works. We're not going to talk about how it works right now. But at the beginning, the very first episode, episode 1, when we labeled that A Time for Growth, we asked this question. We said, what kind of human will you be during the lockdown? Well, now we are on episode 16, which was the end of our initial promised offering. And that theme was already in place, how to reimagine your world. And you can think of, in one sense, that first webinar and this one as bookends. As I say, we are going to continue. But bookends on the content that we have shared with you up till now. So now my reiteration of this question is not what kind of human will you be during, but after. What kind of human are you going to be after lockdown? Because this new world has been forced on us. The world has changed in so many different ways. Zoom, you guys, 3/4 of our viewers probably never heard of Zoom before we started this webinar series. Now you're all using it for everything. I heard a few weeks back that their user count had increased tenfold over this time. So in the last month, they are 10 times bigger than they were. The world has changed, and it's going to have changed after lockdown. We're stepping into a new and uncertain world in nearly every aspect. So what kind of human will you be after lockdown? Are you going to be people who don't have real relationship with those you live with? Or are you going to have built traditions and ways of eating together? Maybe you ask these questions each day like we made available to you a couple of webinars ago. What are your meal times going to look like going forward? Not just during these days when we're stuck at home. What is your life going to look like? There's so many different ways that you can imagine interpreting and answering this question, as you can see from all these drawings. What kind of human will you be after lockdown? Now, we have gone through a whole lot of different ideas and constructs over the course of this webinar. And the argument I want to make is that the imagination is such a vital key element in unpacking so many of these things. Let's look at this. We've got the TED and the drama triangle. Who are you going to be? What kind of human are you going to be? A creator or a victim? Well, it's your imagination that has power there to help you imagine your scenario and your situation in one way or another. Where are you going to go? Are you going to go there? Are you going to go there? Does it really matter? Are you going to choose growth? The imagination is important there. Upward and downward spirals. Being able to take charge of where you are and how you perceive the future looking and create that in your imagination. Very important. Facebook and upward social comparisons and feeling terrible about yourself, as we discussed in the previous webinar, because of your imagination and allowing what you see to feed your imagination. These different ways of disputing all the irrational beliefs. We've got the must or the should, which is that demandingness. We've got the catastrophizing. We've got the on the third one there is the, what is that?
Self-downing.
That one is the self-downing, and then we've got self-downing. We've got the low frustration tolerance. All of these things can be impacted by an imagination going forward into the future and rebuilding the world before you get there. Because that actually rebuilds and changes yourself. Who's going to win? Which dog are you going to feed? Your imagination is so vital. It is so important. What are the lenses you have on your own identities and the way you see the world? Imagination, imagination, imagination. This is my hobby horse. This is my drum. I beat this all the time. All of these things, for positive and for negative, start in the imagination. And that's how we are going to change the world. But how? How do we empower our imagination? Mark, jump in here and speak to us about how. How do we actually go about reimagining our world?
Well, as you've been sharing, Theron, you just reminded me of, or you brought to mind a quote that maybe we can have as your and my quote from now on, that the imagination is the power of being human. And of course, as a psychologist, one of the things that I wrestle with is how do we help people to unlock things that disempower them? In other words, what happens when people psychologically are being dampened in terms of their imagination? So how do we reimagine our world? Well, we have to unlock ourselves psychologically. And I want to just share a couple of concepts today that I think are going to be super helpful for people going forward. And the first thing is that we can probably plot the problems that any one of us face on a spectrum, ranging from, on the very right-hand side, systemic issues. So Africa there represents any problems with the system, systemic issues, legal problems, structural problems, financial problems, etc., etc. All the way across to the left side there, which is problems with the agents in the system. So the individuals, the you and me, that are caught up in the systemic issues. And, I think that one of the major problems with society is that we spend major time on trying to fix systemic issues because it is so hard to scale help to the agents. And so many times the governmental solutions, and we've seen that now in COVID-19, a lot of the solutions are trying to fix some of the systemic problems. Send resources, send help to the health system, medical world. And for some reason, we seem to forget about the agents in the system where imagination is. And I want to put it to you that there's a key problem with some of the agents in the system. And psychologists have shown us quite clearly that the way to change some of the major problems we have in the world, or even just in our own world, is by fixing the psychology of the agents. And I want to illustrate it to you here. This is a study we touched on in one of the episodes, but it was a study done by Martin Seligman, that great father of positive psychology. He was in the early stage of his research, and he created this two-sided dog kennel. On the left-hand side, you can see there was a shock plate on the bottom, and then right in the middle, there was this partition that could be opened or closed. And he put the dogs in on the left side, shocked them, and of course what they did is they got away from the pain. So they jumped across into the side on the right. This was a very normal response to pain. Then what he did is he closed the partition in the middle. In other words, he broke the system. He created a systemic blockage to these agents that were then put in the system. And when it was blocked, when the partition was closed, he put the dogs in there again and shocked them again. And again, they had a very normal response. They would just kind of lie in the most comfortable way possible and take the shock, because of course they couldn't get away. But then something very interesting happened. He then opened up the partition. In other words, he fixed the systemic problem that was holding the agent at bay. And he shocked those same dogs again. And again, they had a very natural response. Instead of jumping across to the other side like they could, they carried on lying there taking the shock, because you see, they had developed something that became known as learned helplessness. And learned helplessness is nothing other than a psychological paradigm that has essentially consumed the agent, that causes one to be stuck in that paradigm, and so essentially to lose the imagination, that one can jump across into the other side. The broken system breaks the imagination. Absolutely.
But it can be fixed.
And the problem is, absolutely, I mean, that's where we're getting to. The problem is that sometimes we fix the systemic issues, and this is what's happened in South Africa at the moment. Now, some of the systemic issues have been fixed, but now the agents are still broken psychologically. And so things like gender, ethnicity, generational issues, the narrative stories that we have still stay as blocks for us, blocking who we are. And so instead of us responding to the system that is now available to us, we stay stuck psychologically. And we see this now in the schooling system, where so many of the systemic issues are changed, and there's still something like a 30% pass rate in some of the schooling environments. And the psychologists have shown the issue here is not IQ, and the issue here is not resources. It's psychological dampening.
Can I
so how
jump
do we
in
fix
quickly?
this?
Sorry, I said, I warned you,
yeah.
I'm going to be beating this drum. One way of saying it is, as Mark has said, it is the psychology which needs to be fixed. The way I have always framed and phrased this is that you cannot imagine something different when your imagination has been straitjacketed for so long. You do not have that ability. So that dog can't even imagine escaping the pain. And the same is true of us, because the character that we have, or the role that our character has in the story, we have played it this way, it has been forced on us this way, and we need to be able to imagine our own role differently. Keep going. Preach.
So how do we solve this? Well, the set of skills that most powerfully helps us to overcome these psychological paradigms that restrict us is the set of skills that we've mentioned in passing a few times, called emotional intelligence. And what you're seeing on the screen here is just one model of emotional intelligence. And all I want you to take out of this is that emotional intelligence is essentially a set of psychological muscles that make people great at managing themselves and interacting with others. And you can see there, in this particular model, there's 5 major categories. If you look at the pizza that's there, there's self-perception. We've spent a bit of time on that in these webinars. How I view myself as a person. There's self-expression, how the way I view myself on the inside starts coming out on the outside. There's interpersonal relationships. We've spent a lot of time on transactional analysis in these webinars. There's decision-making. The way you see the problem is the problem. And then, of course, managing stress. And holstering all of that is this ability for self-awareness. And so all I want us to see here is that emotional intelligence is a set of muscles that can be developed, and the research is amazing around how possible it is to develop this. In short, emotional intelligence develops a little bit like muscles, where something like IQ or cognitive intelligence develops a little bit like bones. In other words, to a certain age, and then it kind of plateaus a little bit. And so we've touched on quite a few things in this webinar series. We've looked at the subconscious mind and how important it is to rewire that. And part of rewiring that is using emotional intelligence competencies. We've also looked at concepts like emotional addiction and a number of concepts around the neuroscience of what's happening for us. All of this, the psychology of the subconscious and the neuroscience, underpins how we develop emotional intelligence. And I think the best way that I can define it for you is to say that how do we create change? In other words, how do we restore ourselves to being these agents that are able to effectively respond to the world and be amazing, imaginative humans? Well, we need to implement techniques over time. And you'll remember that cells that fire together, wire together. We need to rewrite our stories, and the way we do that is to implement techniques over time. And there's one thing that we haven't really spent a lot of time on in this webinar series, and it is, what is this subscription that's been given to you called Mygrow? Many of you have gone onto the Mygrow platform to go and access some of the free resources, but we haven't touched very much on what Mygrow actually is. And it is a platform that develops emotional intelligence by helping you to implement techniques over time. And it brings together 3 things that psychologists would typically do with you: developing emotional intelligence, measuring your emotional intelligence, and tracking emotional intelligence. And these 3 things become such a powerful mechanism for people to change. And what's quite exciting is for people to change at scale. So Mygrow is not just a place for you to get the free resources from this webinar. It actually is a powerful tool to help you now in the lockdown and into the future to create agency and to help to rebuild yourself.
Can I jump in quick? There's actually no better way to explain this to you than with a story. So we're going to show you a little video, actually. We're going to show you just a 4-minute video that plays it out in a story, so you can see the impact that this product has. I know that many of you are watching from very different spheres and walks of life, but Mygrow is very much a tool that is designed for humans, regardless of where you are. So the slant of this video is going to be corporate, but this is for everything. This is for people in a private capacity. Many of you have signed up in a private capacity. And yeah, so we're going to unpack the video a little bit in a minute. So let's take a minute and just watch that quickly.
This is Jane. She's a team leader, but she doesn't trust people, so she struggles to delegate. Andrew is negative all the time. Everybody just wishes he would resign. Anne can't control her temper. Nate can't read the tone in meetings, and he's in sales. Mike and Abigail can't stand each other. Peter lacks confidence. Julie freezes. Grace is defensive. Pam is insensitive. Mary just can't. Next week, Tuesday, at 11:32 a.m., she's going to say something she'll regret for the next 10 years. Life is hard. People are complicated. And Lisa? Well, she's responsible for all of them, and she needs them at their best every single day. She needs managers who can lead, staff who can cope with stress, team members who like each other and work effectively together. She needs to increase productivity and efficiency. But she doesn't know how to make that happen. So, she keeps her LinkedIn page up to date, just in case. But then she discovered Mygrow, the emotional intelligence platform. She signed up.
Just researching it for my team,
she told herself. But then she couldn't stop. She did her droplets each day.
Wow, just 15 minutes. These videos are great.
She learned how her brain works, the conscious and subconscious mind, how her emotional life impacts the way she shows up at work and affects her relationships. She did a quick EQ assessment, getting feedback from people she trusted. She began to appreciate how her emotional, psychological well-being impacted everything, what she believed about herself and how she related to others. She started seeing where she could improve, at work and in her personal life. So she exercised her emotional muscles each day on the Mygrow platform. And with the feedback from her own personal EQ coach, she slowly became better at being herself. She grew in optimism and the ability to manage stress. She became a better leader and found it easier to understand and navigate the office dynamics. She began to imagine what it would be like if everybody grew like she was. So she signed up her whole department. Things really started to change. Anne was skeptical at first, but she got into it. She doesn't hang up on clients anymore. Grace welcomes criticism now. Nate has doubled his sales figures, and Andrew, well, no one wants him to resign anymore. They've all improved their interpersonal relationships, both at work and at home. They handle conflict better. They stay motivated for longer. They've become better people and a more effective team. Work output has increased and the quality's improved too. Lisa and her bosses can monitor progress from a central location, and it's so easy to see why the office culture has shifted.
Anyways, like I was just saying, like, oh my gosh.
Mygrow has changed their behavior. You see, they seem more human, which makes them better professionals. Life is still complicated, of course, but each of them enjoys it a little bit more. And what about Lisa?
I love my job.
Well, she can't even remember her LinkedIn password. Now, here's the important truth. These are real people, like you and me, not cartoons.
More things are within my control than I thought.
What can I develop?
I can improve.
It's been amazing.
I listen more to be a lot more patient.
Reconcile with my husband.
I think the growth opportunities are fantastic.
It changes culture.
I think it's enormous. It would be great for an entire organization to do it. I believe it makes you a better person.
So yeah, as you can see from that video, you get a pretty good idea of the impact that Mygrow can have. Now, a lot of our clients are using Mygrow at the moment, even in a remote context, to be able to really build these competencies and these strengths across the team. Obviously, what the video doesn't deal with is the world of remote working. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we have been forced into a new world and we don't yet know what the world is going to look like. But what we do know is that if we can build these competencies, these emotional skills, it will make us more able to handle whatever comes. You know, Zoom is definitely going to be part of our future, but we don't yet know what else is going to be there.
Yeah.
And the one thing we do know is that we need our humans to be more human. We need them to be unlocked. We need them not to be the little doggies sitting in the kennel who can't imagine something other than the pain they're going through. We need to develop and grow these competencies. Mark, speak to us about what the world reimagined might look like. when these competencies are built.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of people are talking about how, remote work and online and all that stuff is going to change after the lockdown. What I'm interested in as a psychologist is how can our psychology be powerfully, more whole as we return to the work world. And, the world reimagined in my mind looks something like this, and this really excites me. Usually, you can see in the green on the slide, companies or communities or even whole countries, the access to the kind of resources that help to develop people's emotional intelligence. Usually, it is only made available to the most senior people or the people in the higher socioeconomic region. So if it's an organization, it might be senior management. If it's, a country or a community, it might be, the celebrity people that get invited to these kind of things, or those that can afford psychologists. What I'm excited about is that with Mygrow, it's possible now to scale the development of emotional intelligence to everybody within any system. And that makes it so exciting for me, Theron, because I think there's a powerfully different kind of world that could happen after the lockdown if Mygrow can obviously get scaled to more and more people. Because if we can unlock the psychology of the agents in the system, particularly in a system like South Africa, as these systemic things become unlocked, the way that these humans will be able to respond to the world is going to be radically powerful. And just one last thing to say is that, some of this system and agent conversation and learned helplessness and the inability to respond comes from my own story. I had all of the systemic things available to me in South Africa. And yet for so many decades of the early part of my life, I was unable to respond appropriately because my psychology was dampening it for me. And I know that emotional intelligence has, and as I've built those muscles, has helped me to unlock some of my own agency. So one thing I just wanted to end with was, right in the first episode, we had a look at one of the paragraphs towards the end of Nelson Mandela's book. And I just want to share, one of the last ones. He says this, I have walked that long road to freedom. I've tried not to falter. I've made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. We've got through this first lockdown. We're now entering into the extended lockdown, certainly here in South Africa. But there are more hills to climb. They might be with our families. They might be with our organizations. They might be as we come back into organizations. But I know that the muscles of emotional intelligence will make us more and more capable of climbing those hills that we need to. Theron.
Yeah, if we successfully climb the first hill, the strength and the skills that we gained as a result of climbing that first hill, that is the resource to help us get to the next one. We don't know what the future looks like. Many people are saying the next virus could be the big one.
Wow.
Well, let's learn from this one. Let's strengthen ourselves to be able to encounter, and not just encounter and respond to the world, but to take that and rebuild the world going forward. That's what we so desperately need. What's been so interesting at the beginning of the end of this current decade is we've seen a decline in so many things. Around the world, we've seen a decline in trust in our governments. We've seen politics in disarray. We've seen so many things not working. The future, the world needs to be different. And human creatures are the ones who will reimagine, will go there, will see that future and then build it. So we need to unlock our imaginations to be able to do that. We are going to continue with this webinar series, as we have mentioned. We're going to be with you for every weekday until this lockdown, in South Africa at least, is over. Please continue to journey with us. As I've mentioned before, we are going to be reimagining this a little bit so that it's not quite as onerous on us to pull these off each day. They're going to be a little bit shorter. We're not going to have as many guests, but they're still going to be great. They're going to be really, really cool. They may be 10 to 15 minutes. Who knows? They might be a little bit longer, but we really are committed to walking this journey with you, to taking this next hill as well. If you haven't yet signed up for the free Mygrow trial, please do that. And don't just go and get the resources. Do your daily droplets. Just going to get the resources is like buying a Ferrari for the leather seats and then just climbing in, enjoying the leather seats. No, the thing's for driving, driving fast on the highway. So don't just use Mygrow as the place to go and get your resources. Do your daily droplets. That is what's going to actually build these competencies and strengths. We've added a whole lot of resources on there, as you can see. And of course, all the reruns of the webinars are there. Thank you so much for journeying with us over the last 21 days, and please come back and stick with us into the future. Mark, one last thought from you before we say goodbye.
Yeah, this is just the beginning of the next hill, so let's do this. Cheers.
Great. You may be going through this alone, you may be with others, but we're all in this together, and the world we create out of it is the world each of us is going to experience, and the one that our children are going to inherit.
Yeah.
So let's do this. Let's reimagine ourselves. Let's reimagine the world. We'll see you in the next webinar.